Welcome back to Sleepy History and Mysteries channel. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most enduring mysteries that humanity has pondered for over 2,000 years. The story of Atlantis, the lost civilization that has captured imaginations across cultures and centuries. This is a story that sits at the intersection of history, philosophy, geology, and human longing for understanding our past. As you settle in, let's begin by acknowledging what makes Atlantis such a compelling subject. Unlike many historical mysteries, this one has a very specific beginning. We know exactly when and where the story of Atlantis entered human consciousness. It wasn't discovered through archaeological excavation or decoded from ancient tablets. Instead, it came to us through the written words of one of history's most influential philosophers, living in Athens around 360 years before the Common Era. The story begins with Plato, born around 428 before the Common Era. Plato was a student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle, forming a direct lineage of philosophical thought that would shape Western civilization for millennia. He founded the Academy in Athens, one of the earliest institutions of higher learning in the Western world, and his writings have survived remarkably intact through the centuries, giving us an unusually direct window into ancient Greek thought. Plato wrote his works as dialogues, conversations between various characters that explored philosophical questions through debate and discussion. This literary form was common in Greek philosophy, allowing ideas to be examined from multiple angles. Among his many dialogues, two in particular introduced the world to Atlantis: Timaeus and Critias, both written around 360 years before the Common Era. In these dialogues, Plato tells us that the story of Atlantis came through a chain of transmission. According to his account, the Athenian statesman Solon, who lived from about 638 to 558 years before the Common Era, traveled to Egypt. While there, Solon visited the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, where he conversed with Egyptian priests. These priests, Plato tells us, had access to records far older than any Greek historical memory, and they shared with Solon an account of a great island civilization that had existed thousands of years before even their time. Solon apparently intended to write an epic poem about this story, but never completed it. Instead, the tale was passed down through his family. According to Plato, Solon told it to Dropides, and Dropides told it to his son, also named Critias. This elder Critias then shared the story with his grandson, the younger Critias, who appears as a character in Plato's dialogues and recounts the tale of Atlantis. Let's pause here and consider this chain of transmission because it's important for understanding how we should approach the Atlantis story. We have Plato writing around 360 years before the Common Era, presenting a character named Critias, who is recounting a story supposedly told to his grandfather by his great-grandfather Dropides, who heard it from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, who were supposedly reading from ancient records about events that occurred 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. If we take these numbers at face value, this would place the events described around 9,600 years before the Common Era, roughly 11,600 years ago from our present time. This would put Atlantis in what we now call the early Holocene epoch, the geological period that began after the last ice age ended. Now, what exactly did these dialogues tell us about Atlantis? The description is remarkably detailed, which is part of what has made the story so enduring and has inspired so many attempts to locate the actual place. According to Plato's account, Atlantis was a large island located beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The Pillars of Heracles is the ancient name for what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow waterway that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, separating Europe from Africa. So Atlantis was described as being somewhere out in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond this gateway. The island was said to be larger than Libya and Asia combined. Now, when Plato wrote this, Libya referred to the known parts of northern Africa, and Asia meant Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey and the surrounding regions. So he was describing an island of truly massive proportions, something comparable in size to a small continent.
The geography of Atlantis, as Plato describes it, was quite specific. The island had a great plain that was surrounded by mountains. In the center of this plain stood a hill, and it was here that the gods chose to establish their favored city. According to the myth within Plato's story, the sea god Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, whose parents were named Evener and Lusip. They lived on this central hill. To protect Cleito and create a dwelling befitting his divine status, Poseidon transformed the landscape itself. He carved the hill into a series of concentric circles, alternating between rings of water and rings of land. There were 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, all perfectly circular and centered around the highest point where Cleito lived. He also brought forth 2 springs from beneath the earth, one of warm water and one of cold, and made the land abundantly fertile. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 pairs of twin sons. The eldest of these was named Atlas, and it was from Atlas that both the island of Atlantis and the Atlantic Ocean supposedly took their names. Poseidon divided the island into 10 portions, one for each of his sons, making Atlas the High King over all. These sons and their descendants became the rulers of Atlantis, establishing a dynasty that would continue for many generations. The capital city of Atlantis, built on and around that central hill, was an engineering marvel as described by Plato. The Atlanteans constructed bridges across the rings of water and dug a canal from the outermost ring to the sea, allowing ships to sail right into the heart of their capital. They built grand palaces and temples, particularly a magnificent temple to Poseidon at the very center of the city. This temple was described as being adorned with silver, gold, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which shone with a red light. The walls of the city itself were built with stones of different colors, some white, some black, and some red, quarried from the surrounding rings of land. The Atlanteans covered these walls with brass, tin, and orichalcum, creating a shimmering, multicolored appearance that must have been stunning to behold. They built docks for their navy within the rings of water, and guard towers and gates protected the bridges between the rings. Beyond the capital city, the island of Atlantis was described as remarkably fertile and productive. The great plain that surrounded the mountain ring city was itself said to be surrounded by another massive engineering project, a great canal that ran all the way around the plain, receiving water from the mountains and channeling it to the sea. This canal was reportedly 300 feet deep, 600 feet wide, and extended for more than 1,000 miles in length. Connecting to this main canal were numerous smaller channels that created an irrigation network across the entire plain, allowing the Atlanteans to harvest 2 crops per year. The natural resources of Atlantis were abundant. The mountains provided timber of all kinds. The earth yielded precious metals and minerals, including the mysterious orichalcum, which was said to be mined in many parts of the island and was considered second only to gold in value. The island supported both domesticated and wild animals, including elephants, which tells us that Plato envisioned this as a land of considerable size and diverse climate. The Atlanteans themselves, according to the account, were a remarkable people. For many generations, they were virtuous and wise, living according to divine principles. They possessed great wealth but were not corrupted by it. They built a powerful civilization with advanced knowledge of architecture, engineering, and metallurgy. They created a mighty navy and army, not just to defend their own island but to project power across the known world. Their government was described in detail. The 10 kings, descended from the 10 sons of Poseidon, ruled over their respective portions of the island, but they gathered periodically to make decisions affecting the whole island. They would meet in the great temple of Poseidon, and there they would conduct certain rituals, including a sacred bull sacrifice, before consulting on matters of state. Their laws were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the center of Poseidon's temple. For many generations, this system worked well. The Atlantean kings governed wisely, balancing their divine heritage with their mortal nature. They did not become prideful or greedy. They understood that virtue and wisdom were more valuable than material wealth. But as the generations passed, things began to change. The divine portion of their nature became diluted, mixed more and more with mortal characteristics through intermarriage and the simple passage of time. The Atlanteans began to lose sight of the principles that had made their civilization great. They became consumed with ambition and the desire for conquest. Wealth, which had once been treated as a tool for the common good, became an end in itself. This is where the story takes on its moral dimension, which is crucial for understanding what Plato was actually trying to accomplish with this account. The Atlanteans, having lost their virtue, decided to conquer the world. Their powerful navy and army set out to subjugate the peoples of the Mediterranean. They conquered parts of Libya as far as Egypt and parts of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, which we would now identify as the region around Italy. But when they attempted to conquer Athens, they met resistance. According to Plato, ancient Athens represented an ideal state, a perfect society organized according to the principles that Plato himself had outlined in his earlier dialogue, the Republic. The Athenians, though vastly outnumbered, fought valiantly against the Atlantean invasion. Through their courage and skill, and because they represented a just society defending itself against unjust aggression, the Athenians defeated the Atlantean forces. Following this defeat, the gods decided to punish Atlantis for its hubris and corruption. Zeus, the king of the gods, called the other gods together to determine what should be done about the Atlanteans who had fallen so far from their original virtue. And here, frustratingly, Plato's dialogue Critias breaks off mid-sentence. We never learn exactly what Zeus said or what specific punishment was decreed. However, in the Timaeus dialogue, we're told the outcome. Violent earthquakes and floods struck Atlantis, and in a single day and night of catastrophe, the entire island sank beneath the ocean, along with its army. The sea in that area became unnavigable due to shoals of mud created by the sunken island. This, then, is the complete story of Atlantis as Plato presents it. But having laid out the tale, we must now ask the most fundamental question. Did Atlantis actually exist? This question has been debated for more than 2,000 years, and people have reached very different conclusions. To understand why, we need to consider what Plato was trying to do with his dialogues and what literary tradition he was working within. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. His primary concern was exploring ideas about justice, virtue, the ideal state, and the nature of reality itself. He frequently used stories, myths, and allegories to illustrate philosophical points. In the Republic, for instance, he tells the famous allegory of the cave, in which people are chained in a cave and can only see shadows on the wall, mistaking these shadows for reality. No one believes this is a historical account of actual people in an actual cave. It's clearly a philosophical illustration about the nature of knowledge and perception. Similarly, in the same dialogue that introduces Atlantis, the Timaeus, Plato presents an elaborate creation myth involving a divine craftsman called the demiurge who shapes the cosmos according to eternal forms. This cosmology served Plato's philosophical purposes, but it wasn't meant to be a literal scientific account of how the universe was created. So was Atlantis just another philosophical story? Another tool Plato used to explore his ideas about the ideal state and what happens when societies abandon virtue. Many scholars throughout history have thought so. They point out that the story appears in philosophical dialogues, not historical chronicles. They note that Plato's description of ancient Athens as this perfect society defending civilization against barbarism seems to be an idealized projection of the principles he outlined in the Republic rather than a historical account. The timing is also suspicious from a historical standpoint. Plato was writing in the early to mid-4th century before the Common Era. His teacher Socrates had been executed by the Athenian democracy in 399 before the Common Era, and Plato had become deeply disillusioned with democratic governance. The Atlantis story can be read as a cautionary tale about what happens when societies lose their virtue and when democratic institutions become corrupted by wealth and ambition. Moreover, no other ancient source mentions Atlantis before Plato. If this story had truly been preserved in Egyptian records and passed down through Solon, one might expect some other reference to it in Greek literature. But the historical Solon, whose poetry and laws we know about from other sources, never mentions anything about Atlantis in his surviving works. Even in antiquity, many of Plato's own followers believed that Atlantis was fictional. About 30 years after Plato's death, his own student Crantor apparently believed the story was historical, but Crantor's own student, a philosopher named Proclus, tells us that many other ancient scholars considered it a myth created by Plato for philosophical purposes. Yet the story persisted. Part of its power lies in those very specific details: the concentric rings of water and land, the precise measurements, the descriptions of canals and bridges and buildings. These details make Atlantis feel real in a way that purely abstract allegories do not. And they've inspired countless people to wonder, what if there's some truth behind this story? What if Plato based his account on some actual place, some real civilization that existed and was then lost? This question leads us to the second great mystery of Atlantis. If it was real, or if it was based on something real, where was it? The most straightforward interpretation of Plato's text would place Atlantis somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. After all, he specifically says it was beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out in what we now call the Atlantic. For many centuries, this is where people looked. In the late 19th century, a man named Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book that would shape popular understanding of Atlantis for generations to come. Published in 1882, Atlantis, the antediluvian world, argued that Plato's account was essentially historical and that Atlantis had been a real civilization located in the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps on a now-submerged landmass between Europe and America. Donnelly was not a trained archaeologist or historian. He was a lawyer and politician from Minnesota who became fascinated by Atlantis and spent years collecting what he considered evidence for its existence. His book was enormously influential, going through multiple printings and being translated into many languages. It established many of the ideas about Atlantis that persist in popular culture today. The notion of a technologically advanced ancient civilization, the idea that this civilization seeded all other known ancient cultures, and the catastrophic destruction that wiped it out. Donnelly's work was compelling to many readers because he wove together flood myths from different cultures, similarities between ancient civilizations on different continents, and geological theories about vanished land bridges. He suggested that Atlantis was the common source from which ancient civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas all derive their knowledge. However, from a scientific standpoint, Donnelly's theories don't hold up. Geological evidence shows no indication of a large landmass having existed in the Atlantic Ocean and then sinking within human memory. The Atlantic Ocean floor has been extensively mapped, and no evidence of sunken continents has been found. The similarities between ancient civilizations that Donnelly pointed to can be explained by independent invention and the universal challenges that all human societies face, rather than requiring a common source in Atlantis. But Donnelly's book opened the floodgates, so to speak. In the 20th century, the search for Atlantis took on new forms. One particularly influential figure was Edgar Cayce, an American who claimed to be able to enter trance states and access what he called the Akashic Records, a kind of cosmic repository of all knowledge. Edgar Cayce was born in 1877 in Kentucky. In his early life, he became known for apparently diagnosing medical conditions while in trance states, earning him the nickname the Sleeping Prophet. But beyond medical readings, Cayce also claimed to access information about past lives and ancient civilizations, including Atlantis. According to Cayce's readings, which were recorded by stenographers as he spoke in his trance state, Atlantis was not just real but had been an incredibly advanced civilization. Cayce described Atlanteans as possessing technology that in some ways surpassed our own modern capabilities. He spoke of crystal-based power systems, aircraft, and weapons of tremendous destructive potential. He claimed that Atlantis had been destroyed not in a single catastrophe, but through 3 major periods of destruction over thousands of years, with the final destruction occurring around 10,600 years before the Common Era. Cayce also claimed that Atlanteans, knowing their civilization was doomed, fled to other parts of the world, particularly Egypt and the Yucatan Peninsula in Central America, where they supposedly influenced the development of the ancient Egyptian and Mayan civilizations. He even suggested that records of Atlantean civilization were hidden in a chamber beneath the Great Sphinx of Giza, waiting to be discovered. Cayce's readings about Atlantis were elaborate and detailed, and they've influenced a whole stream of New Age thought about lost civilizations and ancient wisdom. However, it's important to note that Cayce's claims were not based on any physical evidence, archaeological findings, or historical documents. They came entirely from his trance states, which he attributed to psychic abilities but which cannot be independently verified or tested using scientific methods. Moreover, some of Cayce's specific predictions about Atlantis have not come to pass. He predicted that in 1968 or 1969, portions of Atlantis would rise from the ocean near Bimini in the Bahamas. In 1968, divers did discover what became known as the Bimini Road, an underwater rock formation that some enthusiasts claimed was evidence of an ancient roadway. However, geological analysis has shown that the Bimini Road is a natural formation of beach rock, limestone formed by the cementing of beach sediments. While it's interesting to look at, it's not evidence of an ancient civilization. As the 20th century progressed and technology improved, the search for Atlantis expanded across the globe. If it wasn't in the Atlantic Ocean, perhaps it was somewhere else? Perhaps Plato's account preserved some memory of a real place, even if the details had been changed or exaggerated over time. This brings us to one of the most intriguing theories about Atlantis, one that actually has some archaeological evidence to support at least part of it. The theory that the Atlantis story might have been inspired by the Minoan civilization and the catastrophic eruption of Thera. The Minoans were a Bronze Age civilization that flourished on the island of Crete and other Aegean islands from roughly 3,650 to about 1,400 years before the Common Era. They built impressive palace complexes, most famously at Knossos, and they were skilled seafarers who traded throughout the Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization was at its height during what we call the Middle and Late Minoan periods, from about 2000 to about 1500 years before the Common Era. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, something catastrophic happened. The volcanic island of Thera, which we now call Santorini, experienced one of the most massive volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. The eruption was so powerful that it caused the center of the island to collapse, creating the distinctive caldera, or volcanic crater, that we see today when we visit Santorini. The caldera is surrounded by the remaining portions of the island, which form a rough ring around the flooded crater. The eruption would have been absolutely devastating. Volcanic ash was blown across the eastern Mediterranean, with deposits found as far away as Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean coast. The explosion would have generated tsunamis that battered the coasts of nearby islands and mainland Greece. Any settlements on Thera itself would have been completely destroyed. One such settlement has been discovered at a site called Akrotiri on Santorini. Excavations there have revealed a remarkably sophisticated Bronze Age town with multi-story buildings, advanced plumbing systems, and beautiful frescoes depicting dolphins, lilies, and scenes of daily life. The site was buried under volcanic ash, much like Pompeii was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius over 1,000 years later. The preservation is remarkable, giving us a vivid snapshot of life in the Aegean Bronze Age. Interestingly, no human remains have been found at Akrotiri. This suggests that the inhabitants had warning, probably from preliminary earthquakes, and were able to evacuate before the final catastrophic eruption. Where they went and what happened to them afterward, we don't know. The destruction of Thera occurred around the same time that we see major changes in the Minoan civilization. While the relationship between the eruption and the decline of the Minoans is debated among archaeologists, the eruption certainly would have caused significant disruption to a maritime trading civilization. So could the memory of Thera's destruction and the decline of Minoan civilization have been the inspiration for Plato's Atlantis story? There are some intriguing parallels. Santorini before the eruption would have been roughly circular. After the eruption, it became a ring of land surrounding a water-filled caldera, which could be seen as vaguely similar to Plato's description of concentric rings, though the specifics don't really match. The Minoans were an advanced civilization with impressive architecture and maritime power. The destruction was sudden and catastrophic. However, there are also significant differences. The eruption of Thera occurred around 1600 years before the Common Era, which would have been only about 1200 years before Plato's time, not the 9,000 years he specifies. Thera is in the Aegean Sea, not beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean. The Minoans, while impressive, didn't conquer most of the Mediterranean as Plato's Atlanteans supposedly did. And critically, Crete itself, the center of Minoan civilization, did not sink into the sea. While the Minoans did eventually decline and were absorbed into Mycenaean Greek culture, this was a gradual process, not a single cataclysmic event. Still, the Santorini theory remains one of the more plausible explanations for how a story like Atlantis might have originated. It's possible that memories of the Thera eruption and the Minoan civilization were preserved in oral tradition, became confused and exaggerated over time, and eventually reached Plato through some chain of transmission, perhaps through Egyptian sources who had traded with the Minoans. Plato could then have adapted this received material for his own philosophical purposes, changing the details to fit his narrative needs. Another location that has been proposed is much farther from the Mediterranean world, the Rikhat structure in Mauritania, Africa. The Rikhat structure, also known as the Eye of the Sahara, is a remarkable geological formation in the Sahara Desert. It's a massive circular structure, about 40 kilometers in diameter, that shows up clearly in satellite imagery as a series of concentric rings. The Rikhat structure has attracted attention from Atlantis enthusiasts because of these concentric rings, which bear at least a superficial resemblance to Plato's description of Atlantis's capital city. Some proponents of this theory argue that the structure matches other details from Plato's account, such as being near mountains and having access to various minerals and resources. However, geologists have studied the Rikhat structure extensively, and there's no mystery about what it is. It's an eroded geological dome, formed by igneous intrusions that pushed up sedimentary rock layers about 100 million years ago. Over time, erosion has worn away the different layers of rock at different rates, creating the concentric ring appearance. The structure is completely natural, and while it's certainly striking to look at, especially from space, it bears no evidence of ever having been inhabited by an advanced civilization. Moreover, the Rikhat structure is located deep in the Sahara Desert, hundreds of kilometers from the ocean. For it to have been Atlantis, we would need to explain how this area was once at sea level and accessible to ships, then somehow rose to become part of the Saharan plateau, and then was abandoned and forgotten. There's no geological evidence to support such a scenario within the time frame that would be relevant to the Atlantis story. Still, the theory has gained a following, particularly on social media and in online communities interested in alternative archaeology. This reflects a broader pattern in how Atlantis theories have evolved in the modern era. With the internet, ideas can spread rapidly, and communities of enthusiasts can form around theories that might not meet the standards of academic archaeology or geology. Indeed, the list of proposed locations for Atlantis has grown to include dozens of sites. The Canary Islands, Malta, Sardinia, Cyprus, various locations in Spain and North Africa, the Caribbean, the North Sea, Sweden, Ireland, and even Antarctica. Some of these proposals are based on serious attempts to match Plato's description with real geographical features. Others seem driven more by local pride or the desire to claim connection to this famous lost civilization. What all of these theories reveal is something important about the Atlantis story itself. It's flexible enough and Plato's account is detailed enough that people can read into it almost anything they want to find. The concentric rings could match a volcanic caldera, a river delta, an eroded geological formation, or any number of circular geographical features. The description of a plain surrounded by mountains could apply to many places around the Mediterranean and beyond. The mention of elephants could be taken as evidence for various locations in Africa, India, or even during the Ice Age, Europe. This flexibility is partly why the Atlantis story has proven so durable. It provides a framework onto which people can project their own ideas about lost civilizations, ancient wisdom, or catastrophic change. It serves as a screen for our hopes and fears about human civilization itself. From a historical and archaeological perspective, the mainstream scholarly consensus is clear. There is no evidence that Plato's Atlantis existed as a real place. No archaeological finds can be definitively linked to it. No ancient records outside of Plato's dialogues mention it. The geological evidence doesn't support the existence of a large island civilization in the Atlantic Ocean that sank in a single day. But this doesn't mean the story has no value or that we should dismiss it entirely. Even if Atlantis never existed as a real place, it exists as a powerful idea, and understanding what that idea meant to Plato and what it has come to mean in our culture tells us something important about ourselves. When Plato wrote about Atlantis, he was writing in a specific historical context. Athens had recently lost the devastating Peloponnesian War against Sparta and its allies. The war had lasted from 431 to 404 years before the Common Era and had ended in Athens's defeat and the temporary overthrow of its democracy. Plato had watched his beloved city-state decline from its position as the leading power in Greece to a humiliated and weakened state. Moreover, Plato was deeply critical of Athenian democracy as it was practiced in his time. He believed that democracy, as it existed in Athens, was prone to corruption, demagoguery, and mob rule. The execution of Socrates in 399 before the Common Era had shown him the worst of what democratic decision-making could produce. In Plato's view, the ideal state should be ruled by philosopher kings, wise and virtuous individuals who understood eternal truths and could govern justly. In this context, the Atlantis story takes on a clear meaning. Ancient Athens, as Plato describes it in the Atlantis tale, represents his ideal state. Orderly, virtuous, militarily formidable despite being outnumbered, and governed by principles of justice rather than by greed or ambition. Atlantis, in contrast, represents what happens when a civilization loses its virtue. Despite all its wealth, power, and technological achievement, Atlantis falls because its people become corrupted. They forget the divine principles that made their civilization great and instead pursue conquest and domination. The message is clear. Virtue matters more than power, wisdom more than wealth. A just society, even if smaller and less materially wealthy, will ultimately prevail over an unjust one. And civilizations that lose their moral foundation, no matter how impressive their achievements, are doomed to fall. This moral interpretation of Atlantis has been revived again and again throughout history, adapted to fit different cultural contexts. In the Renaissance, scholars used Atlantis as an example when debating the nature of ideal commonwealths. In the Age of Exploration, some wondered if the newly discovered Americas might be connected to Atlantis somehow. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Atlantis became associated with ideas about lost golden ages, ancient wisdom traditions, and cautionary tales about technological hubris. The environmental movement, for instance, has sometimes used Atlantis as a metaphor for what might happen to our own civilization if we don't address issues like climate change and environmental degradation. The story of a great civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe resonates in an age when we're becoming increasingly aware of our planet's environmental limits. In literature and popular culture, Atlantis has taken on a life of its own, far removed from Plato's original purposes. It appears in science fiction stories, fantasy novels, films, and television shows. Sometimes it's portrayed as a technologically advanced ancient civilization with crystal-powered cities and flying machines. Sometimes it's an underwater kingdom inhabited by merpeople. Sometimes it's a mystical land where magic and wisdom were preserved before being lost to the modern world. These popular culture versions of Atlantis often tell us more about our own desires and anxieties than they do about the ancient world. The image of Atlantis as a technologically advanced civilization destroyed by its own weapons speaks to Cold War fears about nuclear annihilation. The idea of Atlantis as a keeper of ancient wisdom that we've lost reflects a nostalgia for imagined past golden ages and a sense that modern life, despite all its conveniences, might be missing something essential. There's also something deeply appealing about mysteries in general, and Atlantis provides an inexhaustible mystery. Unlike many historical questions that can be settled through archaeology and documentary evidence, Atlantis remains tantalizingly out of reach. We can't prove it existed, but neither can we definitively prove it didn't if we allow for the possibility that Plato based his story on some real place that simply hasn't been correctly identified yet. This ambiguity allows the mystery to persist, giving each new generation the opportunity to engage with it anew. It's worth noting, too, that the search for Atlantis, even if ultimately futile, has sometimes led to genuine discoveries. Expeditions looking for Atlantis have explored remote islands, mapped underwater features, and uncovered ancient settlements. The Akrotiri excavation on Santorini, while it didn't find Atlantis, has provided invaluable insights into Bronze Age Aegean civilization. Underwater archaeology has advanced in part because of interest in sunken cities and lost civilizations, even if the specific city being sought was mythical. In this way, Atlantis serves a function similar to other great quests in human history. Just as the search for the Fountain of Youth led to the European exploration of Florida, or the search for El Dorado drove exploration of South America, the search for Atlantis has motivated people to explore, to question, and to learn about the real ancient world even if they haven't found the specific thing they were looking for. What, then, should we make of all the theories about Atlantis being in specific locations? Should we dismiss them all as pseudoscience and wishful thinking? Or is there value in considering them? The answer, perhaps, lies in maintaining a balance between open-minded curiosity and rigorous critical thinking. It's good to be interested in ancient civilizations, to wonder about what might have existed in the past, and to be open to new discoveries. Archaeology is a field where new findings regularly change our understanding of the past. Cities that were thought to be mythical have turned out to be real. Civilizations that were unknown to modern scholars have been discovered. The past is far richer and more complex than we often imagine. At the same time, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If someone proposes that a specific site is Atlantis, we should ask, what archaeological evidence supports this? Does it match the historical and geological record? Are there more straightforward explanations for the features being attributed to Atlantis? Are the proponents of this theory cherry-picking facts that support their conclusion while ignoring contradictory evidence? These are the questions that professional archaeologists and historians ask, and they're good questions for anyone interested in the past. The scientific method, which involves forming hypotheses, testing them against evidence, and being willing to revise or abandon ideas that don't fit the facts, is our best tool for understanding what actually happened in history. By this standard, no proposed location for Atlantis has yet met the burden of proof. The Santorini theory is interesting and has the virtue of connecting to real archaeological sites and events, but the match with Plato's account is imperfect at best. The Atlantic Ocean theory lacks any geological support. The Rick-Hat structure theory relies on misunderstanding geology and ignoring the absence of archaeological evidence. Other proposals tend to focus on one or two features that match Plato's description while requiring us to ignore all the features that don't match. Does this mean we should stop looking for Atlantis or stop being interested in the story? Not at all. But it might mean we should shift our focus from trying to find a literal Atlantis to understanding why the story has such enduring power and what it can teach us. One thing the Atlantis story teaches us is about the nature of historical memory and how stories change over time. If Plato's account was based on anything real, that reality passed through multiple stages of transmission before reaching him. Each stage would have involved translation, interpretation, and potentially modification of the story. The Egyptian priests, if they existed and told Solon anything, would have been interpreting their own records, which might already have been translations or copies of older sources. Solon would have understood the story through a Greek cultural lens. Each retelling within Solon's family would have involved selection and emphasis of certain details over others. And finally, Plato himself shaped the story for his philosophical purposes. This is how oral tradition works. Stories are not passed down unchanged like digital files copied from one computer to another. They're living things that grow and change, that are shaped by each teller and each audience. Elements that resonate with the culture get emphasized. Details that don't make sense get changed or dropped. New details that make the story more compelling get added. This process happens even with more recent history. Consider how stories about World War II, which ended less than 80 years ago and was extensively documented in writing, photographs, and film, still get misremembered and mythologized. If this can happen with recent, well-documented history, imagine what happens to stories that supposedly originated thousands of years before they were first written down. The Atlantis story also teaches us about the human need for meaning and narrative. We don't just want to know what happened in the past. We want to understand why it happened, what it meant, and what lessons we can draw from it. Plato wasn't trying to write a dry chronicle of events. He was trying to communicate philosophical truths about virtue, justice, and the proper organization of society. He packaged these ideas in a compelling narrative because stories are how humans make sense of the world. This is why the Atlantis story has spawned so many theories and has been interpreted in so many different ways across different eras. Each generation finds in the story reflections of its own concerns. The 19th century, witnessing rapid industrialization and the power of technology, imagined Atlantis as a technologically advanced civilization destroyed by its own inventions. The 20th century, living under the shadow of nuclear weapons, saw in Atlantis a warning about weapons of mass destruction. Our own era, grappling with climate change and environmental crisis, can read Atlantis as a cautionary tale about civilizations that exceed their environmental limits. All of these interpretations tell us something true, not about whether Atlantis was real, but about human civilization and the challenges we face. Great civilizations do rise and fall. Technological advancement doesn't necessarily bring wisdom or virtue. Military power doesn't guarantee moral rightness. Wealth and material success can corrupt as easily as they can elevate. These are lessons that remain relevant whether Atlantis itself was fact or fiction. There's also something profound in the very image of a lost civilization beneath the waves. Water covers about 71% of Earth's surface, and the depths of the ocean remain largely unexplored. The ocean floor contains countless features we've never examined in detail. During ice ages, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today, areas that are now underwater were dry land. People lived in these places, built settlements, created cultures. All of that is now beneath the sea. We know this has happened. The English Channel, the body of water separating Britain from continental Europe, was once dry land called Doggerland. During the last ice age, this was a populated region where hunter-gatherers lived and worked. As the ice age ended and sea levels rose, Doggerland was gradually flooded. The last remnants became islands, and then those too disappeared beneath the waves, probably around 6,500 years before the Common Era. Fishermen still occasionally dredge up stone tools and animal bones from the North Sea floor, remnants of the people and creatures who once lived on Doggerland. Similarly, at the end of the last ice age, coastal settlements around the world would have been inundated as sea levels rose. Any archaeological evidence from these settlements is now underwater, often buried under sediment, extremely difficult to find and study. We know these places existed, but most of them are lost to us, inaccessible beneath the waves. So in a very real sense, there are lost civilizations underwater, even if none of them match Plato's description of Atlantis. This lends a certain poetry to the Atlantis story. It may not be historically accurate, but it captures something true about human experience. The knowledge that the past is partially inaccessible to us, that entire worlds have vanished, that much of human history is irretrievably lost. This sense of loss connects to deeper questions about time and memory. What does it mean that most of human history leaves no lasting trace? Individual lives, communities, even entire civilizations can vanish, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence of their existence. If that, the ancient Egyptians, who built monuments designed to last forever and left us extensive written records, are better known to us than many other ancient peoples. But even Egypt's glory has faded. The Great Pyramids still stand, but the civilization that built them is gone, known to us only through ruins and texts that require specialist knowledge to interpret. If civilizations as powerful and long-lasting as ancient Egypt eventually fade, what hope is there for any human achievement to endure? This is a question that has troubled thoughtful people throughout history, and the Atlantis story speaks to it. Here was supposedly a civilization of unmatched power and sophistication, and yet it vanished so completely that only a fragmentary story survived. If Atlantis, with all its wonders, could be swallowed by the sea and forgotten, what does that say about the permanence of human works? The traditional answer, the one that Plato himself might have given, is that physical things are impermanent but ideas and principles endure. Atlantis's buildings and ships and treasures were destroyed, but the story survived because it contained a moral lesson that people found valuable. The material civilization passed away, but the wisdom it was meant to illustrate remained. This is why Plato's dialogues have survived for over 2,000 years, while countless other ancient texts have been lost. They weren't preserved because they contained accurate historical information about specific events. They were preserved because they explored ideas that each generation found relevant. Questions about justice, knowledge, virtue, the best way to organize society, the nature of reality itself. In this light, asking whether Atlantis was real might be missing the point. The more important question is, What does the Atlantis story tell us that remains valuable? What insights does it offer? One insight is about the relationship between power and virtue. Plato was writing in a world where Athens, at the height of its power during the 5th century before the Common Era, had also been at the height of its cultural achievements. This was the age of Pericles, of the Parthenon, of the great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But this golden age didn't last. Athens's imperial ambitions led to the Peloponnesian War, which exhausted the city and ended in defeat. Plato saw firsthand how the pursuit of empire and the corruption of democratic institutions led to Athens's decline. The Atlantis story captures this trajectory. A civilization begins with virtue and divine favor, achieves great things, but then becomes corrupted by its own success and ultimately faces destruction. This pattern recurs throughout history. We can see it in the Roman Empire, which began as a republic with citizen soldiers defending their homeland and evolved into an empire that eventually collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. We can see it in more recent empires that rose to global dominance and then declined. The story suggests that external power without internal virtue is unsustainable. A civilization can have impressive technology, vast wealth, and a mighty military, but if the people lose sight of what makes a society worth preserving, if they become consumed by greed, ambition, and the desire for conquest, then all that power becomes a liability rather than an asset. This remains relevant today. Modern industrial civilization has achieved wonders that would have seemed like magic to Plato. We can communicate instantly across continents. We can travel through the air faster than sound. We can manipulate matter at the atomic level. We've even sent humans to walk on the moon. Yet we also face challenges that our technological power has created. Climate change driven by industrial emissions, nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization, ecological degradation from unsustainable exploitation of resources. In this context, the Atlantis story asks us, what good is all our power and knowledge if we lack the wisdom to use it well? What good is material prosperity if it comes at the cost of environmental destruction? What good is technological advancement if it doesn't make us happier, more fulfilled, or more just? These are not easy questions, and Plato didn't provide simple answers. But by telling the story of a great civilization that fell because it lost its virtue, he invited his readers to think seriously about what makes a civilization worth sustaining and what might cause it to fail. Another insight from the Atlantis story is about the power of nature and the limits of human control. Whether we interpret the destruction of Atlantis as divine punishment or natural catastrophe, the message is similar. There are forces beyond human control that can destroy even the mightiest civilizations. We know this is true. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, droughts, and other natural disasters have destroyed cities and toppled civilizations throughout history. The eruption of Vesuvius buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. The earthquake that struck Lisbon in 1755 killed tens of thousands and destroyed much of the city. The Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 killed over 200,000 people across multiple countries. More recently, we've seen hurricanes, wildfires, and floods cause devastating damage even in wealthy, technologically advanced nations. Climate change is making many of these disasters more frequent and more severe. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities around the world. Changing weather patterns are causing more intense storms, longer droughts, and more devastating wildfires. Some island nations face the very real prospect of being submerged by rising seas within this century, making the Atlantis story of a civilization lost beneath the waves suddenly feel less like ancient myth and more like a possible future. The Atlantis story reminds us that we live on a dynamic planet where change is constant and catastrophe is always possible. Building a resilient civilization means not just achieving power and prosperity, but also preparing for disruptions we can't prevent, adapting to changes we can't avoid, and recognizing that our relationship with the natural world is not one of domination but of interdependence. There's also something to be learned from the very persistence of the Atlantis mystery itself. The fact that people have been searching for Atlantis for over 2,000 years, proposing location after location, developing theory after theory, tells us something about the human need for discovery and mystery. We live in an age when much of the Earth has been mapped and explored. Satellite imagery has given us views of almost every part of the planet's surface. We've plumbed the depths of the oceans, climbed the highest mountains, and explored both poles. In some ways, the age of geographical discovery seems to be over. There are no more blank spaces on the map, no more unknown continents waiting to be found. Yet the search for Atlantis persists precisely because it offers the tantalizing possibility of discovery, of finding something that has eluded everyone else, of solving a mystery that has puzzled humanity for millennia. It speaks to our desire to believe that there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, that history still holds surprises, that the past is not entirely known and settled. This desire is not inherently wrong. In fact, it drives legitimate scientific inquiry. Archaeologists and historians continually discover new things about the past. Ancient cities are still being uncovered. New texts are still being translated. New techniques like DNA analysis and satellite imagery are revealing information that was previously inaccessible. The past genuinely does hold surprises, and maintaining curiosity about it is healthy. The key is to channel that curiosity in productive directions, to engage with the actual evidence we have rather than the evidence we wish we had, and to be excited by the real discoveries that archaeology and history can offer even if they don't match our preconceptions. For instance, we might not find Atlantis, but we have found cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the Indus Valley, revealing a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that was unknown to modern scholars until the 20th century. We've discovered the Terracotta Army in China, providing unprecedented insights into the Qin dynasty. We've uncovered Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a temple complex that predates agriculture and challenges our assumptions about the development of civilization. We've used LiDAR technology to reveal extensive Maya cities, hidden under jungle canopy, showing that Maya civilization was far larger and more complex than previously thought. These are real lost civilizations, real mysteries that have been solved, real discoveries that expand our understanding of human history. They may not match the specific details of Plato's Atlantis, but they demonstrate that the past is indeed full of wonders and that continued exploration and study can reveal things we never imagined. Perhaps, in the end, this is the most important lesson of Atlantis. Not that we should find one specific lost city, but that we should remain curious about the past, continue exploring and questioning, maintain a sense of wonder about human history and achievement, while also maintaining the critical thinking skills to distinguish between genuine evidence and wishful thinking. The story of Atlantis also serves as a reminder of the importance of preserving knowledge and memory. If Atlantis had been real and had been destroyed as Plato describes, leaving only vague memories that eventually became myth, this would represent a catastrophic loss of knowledge and achievement. Everything the Atlanteans had learned, every technological innovation they had made, every artistic masterpiece they had created, would be gone, accessible only through fragmentary stories that might or might not be accurate. This is not just hypothetical. We know that knowledge has been lost throughout history. The Library of Alexandria in ancient Egypt housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world. Its destruction, whether through a single catastrophic fire or gradual decline, represented an immense loss of texts that we can never recover. We know that Greek and Roman authors wrote works that we now know about only through references in surviving texts. The actual works themselves are lost. We know that many ancient civilizations had writing systems that we still can't decipher, meaning that any knowledge they recorded is inaccessible to us. Even in more recent times, knowledge has been lost. Indigenous cultures around the world had sophisticated understanding of their local environments, medicinal plants, sustainable resource management, and other practical knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. Much of this knowledge was lost when these cultures were disrupted or destroyed by colonization and disease. What remains often exists only in fragmentary form, preserved by anthropologists or in the memories of elders, always at risk of being lost completely as the last speakers of languages die or as traditional ways of life are abandoned. In our own era, we create vast amounts of digital information, but we don't have good long-term storage solutions. Digital storage media degrade over time. File formats become obsolete. Without active maintenance and periodic migration to new systems, digital records can be lost just as surely as ancient manuscripts were lost to fire or decay. Future historians might have more difficulty accessing early 21st century digital documents than we have accessing medieval manuscripts written on parchment. The Atlantis story, whether fact or fiction, reminds us that preservation of knowledge requires ongoing effort and that we should not take for granted that future generations will have access to what we know. It suggests the importance of creating durable records, of teaching knowledge to the next generation, of maintaining libraries and archives, and of valuing the accumulated wisdom of the past even as we create new knowledge in the present. As we come to the end of our exploration of Atlantis, it's worth reflecting on what this story has meant across the centuries and what it might continue to mean in the future. For Plato, Atlantis was a philosophical illustration, a way to explore ideas about the ideal state, virtue, justice, and the causes of civilizational decline. The story was not meant to be a historical account, but a thought experiment that would make his philosophical points more vivid and memorable. For later generations, Atlantis became something different. It became a mystery to be solved, a lost civilization to be found, a symbol of ancient wisdom and knowledge that might be recovered. It became a mirror in which people saw their own concerns reflected. Fears about technological destruction, nostalgia for imagined golden ages, anxieties about environmental catastrophe, hopes for hidden knowledge that might solve contemporary problems. The flexibility of the Atlantis story, its ability to be reinterpreted in different ways for different purposes, is part of what has made it endure. It's vague enough to be adapted but specific enough to feel real. It's grand enough to fire the imagination but grounded enough in recognizable human concerns about power and virtue and rise and fall to feel relevant. Going forward, Atlantis will likely continue to inspire searches and theories. New technologies will enable exploration of previously inaccessible places, and some people will always hope that these explorations might reveal evidence of Plato's lost civilization. Amateur enthusiasts will continue to propose new locations and interpretations. The story will continue to appear in popular culture, adapted and reimagined for new audiences. But perhaps the most valuable role Atlantis can play is not as an object of literal searching, but as a prompt for reflection. What does it mean to build a sustainable civilization? How do we balance power with virtue, technological capability with wisdom, material prosperity with justice, and environmental stewardship? What should we preserve for future generations? What lessons can we draw from the rise and fall of past civilizations? These are the questions that matter, regardless of whether Atlantis was real. And these are the questions that Plato's story, over 2,000 years old but still resonant, continues to ask us. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might let your mind wander through the images the Atlantis story conjures. Picture those concentric rings of land and water gleaming in the sun. Imagine the great temple to Poseidon at the center, its walls covered in precious metals, its interior decorated with statues and offerings. Envision the canals bringing ships from the sea into the heart of the city, the bridges connecting the rings, the palaces and gardens and fountains. Whether this place ever existed or not, it exists now in imagination, kept alive by Plato's words and by the countless people who have engaged with his story over the millennia. In that sense, Atlantis is real, not as a physical place that you could visit, but as an idea that continues to shape how we think about civilization, achievement, and loss. And if Atlantis is a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when civilizations lose their virtue and exceed their bounds, then perhaps the real way to honor its memory is not to search for its ruins, but to learn from its supposed mistakes. to build our own societies with wisdom as well as power, with justice as well as prosperity, with humility before nature as well as technological capability. The ocean keeps its secrets well. The past, in many ways, remains mysterious and inaccessible. We piece together what we can from the evidence that survives, but vast stretches of human history remain unknown and perhaps unknowable. Atlantis, whether it existed or not, represents all those lost stories, all those vanished peoples and places that we can only imagine. But we also have the present and the future. We have the opportunity to create civilizations that might endure, to pass on knowledge to future generations, to learn from the mistakes of the past, whether those mistakes were made by real civilizations or by the cautionary examples invented by philosophers. As you settle into sleep, rest easy knowing that mysteries like Atlantis remind us that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we often imagine. They invite us to stay curious, to keep questioning, to maintain a sense of wonder about the universe and our place in it. The search for Atlantis may never end, and perhaps that's fitting. Some mysteries are more valuable unsolved, continuing to inspire curiosity and imagination generation after generation. Whether Atlantis was a real place lost beneath the waves or a philosophical fiction created by one of history's greatest thinkers, it has earned its place in human culture and consciousness. And now, as the story draws to a close and the mysteries remain mysteries, you can let these thoughts and images fade gently away, carried off like waves returning to the ocean, leaving you in quiet stillness, ready for rest. If you've enjoyed this exploration of history and mystery, consider subscribing to join us for more gentle journeys through the past. There are countless stories waiting to be told, countless questions to ponder, countless wonders to discover in the long record of human civilization and the even longer story of our planet. Until next time, rest well, and may your dreams carry you to places both known and unknown, both real and imagined. In that vast territory where history and legend blur together like the horizon where sea meets sky. Sleep well,